boys and girls. My name's Mrs. Lazar, and I'm here to teach you a writing lesson today. But first, before we begin, I want to show you something. Take a look at this. Does anyone know what that is?
A map.
You're right, it's a map. Well, why do we use a map? Who can tell me?
To get a bird's eye view.
Tell you where you're going.
That's right again. We use a map so that we know where we're going. It gives us a sense of direction. It shows us how we can move around. Well, today I have a different kind of map. Today's map is a writing map. Now, your teacher might call this writing map a graphic organizer. And I want to show you what our writing map looks like. So, meet the narrative writing diamond. This narrative writing diamond is a map for us. Authors use it when they want to plan a story and when they're trying to remember how a story should go. And that's how you're going to use it as well. You should have one of these maps right on your desk. Your teacher will give you a narrative writing diamond, and we're going to color code that.
Hello, students. I can show you how to make your story shine. Add a little sparkle.
All right, that's enough of that. Let's analyze the narrative writing diamond. So, boys and girls, when we take a look at this, you're going to notice that there's a small part up here on the top. Who can tell me what that part is?
The beginning.
That part's the beginning. We call it the entertaining beginning. And we call it an entertaining beginning because we want to capture the reader's attention. We want them to be excited about what we're writing. And so immediately we have to capture their attention. That's why we call it the entertaining beginning. Otherwise, it would be boring.
Yeah, but I've seen a lot of kids write pages of beginning. Getting up, getting dressed, eating breakfast, deciding what to do. Whew.
The entertaining beginning also has to start as close to that main event as possible. We want to make sure that we're not home eating breakfast or getting dressed, but that we're right there in the story, engaging the reader. We're going to learn a little bit more about entertaining beginnings as the year progresses, and we'll get further and further into some of that detail. So let's go to the next part of the diamond. Right here, you see that it says elaborative detail. Well, what's elaborative detail? Elaborative detail is the part of the story where the author stops the story action and then describes something that's really important to the story. And there are three things that are usually really important to the story. One of them might be the setting, where the character is finding himself or herself. Another might be the character. Maybe it's an interesting character that comes into the setting. And then another most important part might be an object, a story critical object. So when the author stops the story action, they describe something really important to the story. And here's how they do it. They use something that's really important, like they might use their eyes, or their ears, or their mouth, or their nose. What are those things called?
The 5 senses.
Yes, you got it. It's all about the 5 senses. So the author wants to be sure that you, the reader, can enter into the story world, and the author does that through elaborative detail. All right, let's look at the next part of the diamond. This is where that most important part comes in, remember? We're moving into the middle of the diamond. Right before we get to what we call the main event, there's this part right here. Anyone see that? What's that one called? Suspense. That's my favorite part of the whole story. You know why it's my favorite part? Because this is where the author leads you slowly into what's going to be happening in the story. The author gives you just a little hint about what's to come. And suspense leads us right into the biggest part of the diamond. You can see it right here. Who can tell me what that part is all about?
The main event.
You got it. It's called the main event. It's the biggest part of the story. That's where you, as an author, are going to spend the most time writing your story. So, we've gotten to that point. We've entertained the reader. We've given them a nice, quick beginning. We've moved into elaboration. Give the reader a little taste of what's about to come, and then we go into the main event. Remember, the biggest part of the story. Now, notice something else. We're moving down in the diamond here. What do you see here?
It's getting smaller.
That's right, it's getting smaller. Why do you think it's getting smaller? Because the author only wants to spend a small amount of time writing. So, the main event has to come to a close. There's a conclusion of some sort. If you were writing a story that had a problem, your problem is solved right here in that conclusion. If you were writing a personal experience story, then your experience comes to an end. And that's what we call the conclusion or the solution of the problem. Not so fast. That extended ending is really important. That's where the author is going to take a little bit of time and give you maybe a memory of the main character. Perhaps the main character has a wish or a hope. All of that shows us how the main character has grown or changed because of the story. So, when you look at this writing map right here, the narrative writing diamond, you want to remember that all of those parts are so important, and they help us to remember how a story goes. Just like if you were planning a trip and you needed to draw a map of where it was you were heading, this is a writing map. This is an author's map to show us exactly how a story should look.
In a moment, your teacher is going to pause the video and read you the story titled Rough Weather. Close your eyes, listen carefully, imagining the scene as it unfolds.
Now you're going to get a chance to look at a story. The name of the story is called Rough Weather. Sounds like a
That's a problem.
problem. You got it. And as you look at this story, Rough Weather, you're going to get a chance to color code it just the way you saw all the parts of the narrative writing diamond color coded. And your teacher is going to help you to walk through that story so that you can understand what each of those parts look like. We call it analyzing a story. And now it's time for you to do that. Now, let's read the story Rough Weather all together. You should have a clean copy on your desk, and I want you to follow along as I read the story. We're going to look for evidence of all the parts of the diamond. Remember, the diamond is a map. It shows us how a story gets put together. So let's see if we can find all of those parts in this story. Grandma stood by the kitchen window, peeking out from behind the curtains. I watched a frown spread across her face. I squeezed in front of Grandma and peered out the window. Whoa! That's an entertaining beginning, all right. The author used a little bit of action. What are you wondering? I'm wondering something. I'm wondering, why is Grandma frowning as she looks out the window? What's going to happen? What's out there? That's what a good entertaining beginning does. It gets you wondering or worrying a little bit about the story. Let's continue. The sky was a peculiar, dark gray color, almost green. The wind blew the leaves off the trees and whipped them around the yard. Suddenly, black clouds rolled in. It was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but it looked like night. Just then, the yard lit up. A bolt of lightning ripped through the sky and pow! Grandma gasped and yanked me away from the window. "Get back!" she shouted. The window seemed to rattle at the thunderous boom. That lightning had struck somewhere nearby. Whoa! Sounds like a problem going on in this story, doesn't it? What's the problem? Can you tell? How can you tell? Well, you know, the author did a really good job describing the setting. That's why we know that there's a problem and a storm is coming. We're going to continue the story with a little bit of suspense. Remember, if you look at the diamond, that's where we're headed. That's our roadmap. Then it happened. I'm wondering, what happened? I gasped. My heart raced. The author's just showing us how the character feels. How do you think the character's feeling? Yeah, I agree. I think that character's a little bit nervous. The lights went out. We stood there in the dark, Grandma and me, taking a minute for our eyes adjust to the dark. What would we do, alone here in the dark? Would we be safe? How long would the lights be out? Those are some really good story questions. The character in the story is wondering and worrying something. Usually, if the character is wondering or worrying something, so are we, the readers. What are you wondering? What are you worrying? I bit my lower lip and I looked at Grandma. Okay, she said. Again, I bit my lower lip. That's a little bit more of those character feelings, right? So, at this point, we've had our entertaining beginning. We've gone into our elaborative detail all about the setting. The author added a little bit of suspense. What part do you think's coming next? I think you guessed it. It's the main event. Now remember, the main event is the biggest part of the story. It's going to tell us what the whole story is all about. Let's find out what happens to the main characters. We're going to play Pioneer Days. She took me by the hand. We're going to pretend it's the olden days, she said. The days before electricity. Right there, the author uses just a little bit of dialogue to see how the story continues. We felt our way across the kitchen with our hands, taking tiny, shuffling baby steps. I ran my hands along the edge of the counter until I felt the knob of our junk drawer. I carefully pulled it open and rummaged inside. All of that shows a little bit of action. And here's a little more dialogue. Here's the flashlight, I exclaimed, shining the round beam around the dark room like a spotlight. Grandma took it from my hand. Hey, I began. Another bolt of lightning lit up the room for a moment. The following crash of thunder made us both jump. Grandma took a deep breath. The pioneers didn't have flashlights, she said, and she shoved the flashlight back in the drawers. Whoa. So right there, what you've seen, a little bit of dialogue, some action, and some more description. So in a main event, the author's going to mix it all up, everything, so that they can showcase that great story. Let's keep going. She felt her way to the cupboard and came back with something in her hands. I squinted to see what she had. Candles and matches. Together we lit the candles and placed them in the kitchen. The storm continued outside, but the kitchen was suddenly cozy in the flickering light. What did pioneers do for fun? I asked. Grandma took a candle in her hand and went down the hall. She came back with a big bag and set it on the table. She took out skeins of yarn. Pioneers worked together and sang songs, she said. She began to hum, and I watched her pull the end of the yarn and begin wrapping it in a ball. She handed me another skein. I fumbled to find the end, and when I found it, I began to wrap it loosely around my index finger. I slipped it off my finger and began to roll a ball of yarn, just like Grandma. By now, she'd started to hum. I didn't know the tune, but it was easy. I joined in, humming and then whistling. Grandma smiled at me, and we sat there together, humming, whistling, and winding balls of yarn. It was amazing how cozy the soft yarn felt in my hands and how I lost all sense of time. The rain pounded on the roof and windows. The lightning flashed and thunder boomed. But still, sitting there like pioneers was the coziest feeling. I looked at Grandma, and she met my eyes and smiled. I smiled back. So, in this main event, we find that the characters are a little afraid at first. But then what happens? What does Grandma do? Grandma finds something for them to do, right? Kind of takes their mind off of it a bit. And then ultimately, how do they feel at the end? Here's a clue. I looked at Grandma, and she met my eyes and smiled. I smiled back. Now, we're going to continue the main event, but this is what we call the conclusion. Right there in the diamond, you'll see the tiny little bottom of the main event is what we call the solution of a problem or the conclusion of an experience story. Let's see what happens. Just then, the lights flickered once or twice and came back on. In a blink, everything was back to normal. So, that's the end of our main event. But remember, there's an extended ending. It's not really the end of the story. The extended ending, where does that fall on the diamond? You got it, right at the bottom. Let's find out how this story really ends. I should have felt happy, but strangely, I felt a little sad. Though it was wet and wild outside, I'd never forget the warm, safe feeling I had sitting with Grandma in the candlelight. I almost wished the lights had stayed out a little longer. I knew I would never be able to capture that feeling again. So that extended ending just gives you that moment of reflection. How did the character feel? Kind of mixed feelings, right? A little happy, a little sad. And then the character revealed some memories, right? I'd never forget the warm, safe feeling I had sitting with Grandma in the candlelight. And then there's a wish. I almost wish the lights had stayed out a little longer. And then finally, that decision. I knew I would never be able to capture that feeling again. So, boys and girls, hopefully you've seen through all of the instruction today how that diamond works as a road map. Remember, it shows us where all the pieces have to fit. Later on, we're going to practice every single one of those pieces with our teacher. We're going to make sure that we know how that road map goes, and we'll be ready to write a long piece when it's our time.